Hello, and welcome to FTT Chats, where we sit down with some of the great and the good of fintech for a bit of a chat. I'm Liz Lumley, and today I'm speaking to Caroline Dawson of Clifford Chance. Hello, how are you, Caroline?
Hello, I'm good. Thanks very much.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask you my first question that I ask everyone on our FTT Chats, and that is, who are you and what do you do?
So I'm Caroline Dawson. I'm a partner in the financial regulation team at Clifford Chance in London. I suppose I specialise in bank regulation, and that covers a wide range of sales and trading activity, capital requirements, and then also ends up touching on some of the areas which are obviously relevant to fintechs as well.
Excellent. So you took part in our virtual spring event on June 10th. Thank you very much. You were part of a Power Woman panel that everyone was very excited about. But what you guys talked about a lot was the industry's reaction to COVID-19 and the global pandemic that we've all been living through over the past few months. What are some of the major impacts you're seeing right at the moment?
Yeah, so I think we mentioned a couple of the issues on the panel the other day, and I think really a lot of the issues that we identified right at the outset are still persistent issues. So, for example, some of the issues that firms have faced in complying with their regulatory obligations in a situation where large numbers of employees are working remotely. So I suppose thinking about things like compliance with trade reporting obligations, recording of telephone conversations, or whether that extends to video as well, monitoring trading, making sure that you're making all your suspicious transaction reports. And then I think all the issues that firms are facing in managing teams remotely. So managing the difficulties that people might be having in working from home while also trying to manage childcare or care for elderly relatives. And then all the confidentiality issues that come alongside working from shared living spaces as well. And I think as lockdown's gone on, some of the issues that we anticipated might become a problem have actually turned out to be concerns. Okay. And the key concern here, I think, is cybersecurity. And we mentioned this very briefly on the panel, that this could become a problem, particularly with large numbers of people working on home networks rather than in the office. And I think there's been maybe an opportunity to see how that's played out. So one of the tech companies recently carried out a survey of financial institutions, and I think almost 80% of the firms surveyed had seen an increase in cyber attacks over the previous 12 months. So that's bad enough, with an increase of 238% between February and April 2020. So clearly that's at the height of lockdown. And firms are seeing an increase in things like phishing attacks, as well as more sophisticated techniques. And really, obviously, people are taking advantage of the fact that more business is being done by email. More people are working remotely, and maybe they just don't have someone sitting right next to them to give that sense check as to whether or not they should open that attachment, click on that link. And then obviously people are also taking advantage of the fact that more people are working over systems that aren't protected to the same standards as office systems.
Yeah.
I think probably tying into this, we've seen an increased focus on operational resilience. So thinking here about the impact that there is on business of IT outages, of cyber attacks, disruption to supply chains, access to premises. And firms will have processes around this that have crisis management policies, business continuity plans. But I think really the current disruption has given firms a key opportunity to revisit all of these policies and all of these plans and test them against real life situations. And I think that's very much, for regulated firms, that's very much the expectation of the regulators, that they'll use this situation to stress test those policies and those plans.
I think you make a really excellent point about, it's interesting, some of the sort of barriers and firewalls that are sometimes annoying, but that keep people's work at banks safe, kind of also would stop them from having remote work and working from home. And it's like, those two things working against each other, which of course you brought up is bringing up problems. Yeah,
and I think, we've seen this particularly with webinars and with video conferences. That some of the platforms which were adopted quite early on, like Zoom, for example, then turned out to present problems with cybersecurity. So it's obviously everyone's learning on the job really with this.
Yeah, interesting. So I wanted to maybe why don't we look a little bit further, into the future and look at that long tail. I think you might have mentioned it on the panel at the event, about like sort of recording and mobile phones and that type of issue that happened with banks. What is some of the impact that we're seeing right now that we're going to feel for the next few years?
Yeah, so I think probably the main impact that we're going to see, that we feel over the next few years, is going to be anything that's caught the regulators' attention.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of what came out of the last, well, I say the last, I mean, we're not currently in a financial crisis, but what came out of the 2008 financial crisis was essentially 10 years of regulation. And this is another systemically important market-wide event.
Mm.
And I don't want to depress anyone by saying that it's going to give rise to 10 years of regulation, but clearly it has the potential to give rise to new regulation, because we're seeing novel situations, we're seeing a new angle on existing situations. And I think, regulators are looking at, so for example, people's business continuity planning and how robust that is, their operational continuity plans, the short-term systems and fixes that people put in place to deal with those trading, monitoring and reporting issues that you mentioned a second ago. And I think there's been a huge increase of interest from the regulators on conduct regulation, and particularly thinking about emergency funding and the circumstances in which that's been granted. Again, I think we talked on the panel the other day about the potential for fraud in those circumstances, and I suppose that's for clients who are super keen to get that funding. And then from the other side, you've also got banks who are coming under a lot of pressure to give that funding, because that's what's going to open up the economy. And you've seen focus on banks in Italy and in the UK, other jurisdictions, with regulators saying, well, we don't think that you've been flexible enough around this. We don't think you've been quick enough to give that funding. So there's clearly a lot of pressure on banks to give that funding. But then at the same time, the regulators are saying, well, are you also putting pressure on your clients for some kind of quid pro quo? Are you expecting in return for that funding that you will have an enhanced role on capital raising, for example? So I think there are quite a lot of situations that the regulators are still unpicking. And it's likely that we will see new regulation coming out of those situations.
Okay. So looking forward to another decade of regulation. Well done. But how can we kind of, over the past few years, we have seen regulators and the rise of reg tech and the use of technology to support that. So how is technology really going to play a role in that next decade of regulation?
So I suppose from the regulators' point of view, I know a lot of regulators in the US and the UK and across the EU and other jurisdictions are all very focused on making sure that if there is technology available to help them do a more efficient, do a better job, that they're making the most of that. I suppose just focusing on the UK, because it's what I know the best, we don't have a great history with government or public sector IT projects. So, we've got quite a long history of catastrophic implementation projects. So I suspect that maybe plays into the regulators wanting to be very careful about how they approach this sort of thing. And certainly they would want to be absolutely sure before they implement anything that it's not going to impede their ability to supervise regulated firms. So obvious areas where they could use RegTech, and certainly we're starting to see a move, things like digital regulatory reporting. So just reforming the way in which firms submit their regulatory returns, making sure that that's more automated. Things that they're looking at in addition to that. So some kind of almost like a regulatory version of robo-advice. When you're looking at submitting regulatory applications, so if you're looking at submitting an application for authorization or for change of control, maybe that there'd be some kind of intelligent support that came along with that. And then I think also they've looked at modernising the handbook. So I know both the FCA and the PRA recently have gone through, or at least in the last few years, have gone through a process of really overhauling the handbook, making sure that it works as an online document, that all of the links work, just that it's as usable as possible. One area that I know regulators are looking at is machine executable rules.
Okay.
When you make a change in the FCA handbook, maybe that gets imported straight away across to people's policies. So I think that's potentially a risky approach, and you could find that that's fine, it ends up in the policies, but no one really knows how it got there or what you're supposed to do about implementing it. But certainly it's an area that the regulators are looking at, and that I know they're exploring with particular regulated entities. I think maybe on the slightly riskier side, there's definitely a role for regulation for reg tech in, for example, market monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
So regulators are getting a huge amount of information from OTC derivatives reporting. They're going to start getting it from reporting of securities financing transactions, all of the trade and transaction reports that they currently get under MiFID. It's a vast quantity of information. And I think there's certainly a sensitivity with the regulators that there's a risk that they could spot the next AIB, or they could fail to spot it. So that there would be some kind of massive buildup of risk. In theory, they've got all the information there to spot that and do something about it. But actually, in practice, what happens is, because it's still a manual process, something ends up getting overlooked, maybe.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely potential there, but clearly that's something where the regulators would be really careful, I think, about introducing anything.
Yeah, because I wanted to bring in a question about artificial intelligence. I mean, especially for when we're dealing with such large amounts of data. What is the regulator? What are they saying about how to supervise this and using these types of procedures to do exactly as you described?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one, because again, this has a bit of a mixed history. So I think particularly if you look at the steps that regulators took to supervise and regulate algorithmic trading in MiFID II, we had, for a start, a bit of a struggle trying to work out what that definition of algorithmic trading should actually be in the first place. And then once we had a developed different definition, there was another process for firms to go through to work out, what actually falls within scope of algorithmic trading. So we're talking about literally everything where you press sum in an Excel spreadsheet, or are you actually talking about something that that people think of as algorithmic trading, where you've got some kind of Robert Harris style fear factor algorithm that's taking over the world? And so clearly the actuality lies somewhere between the two, and I'm not sure that the regulators necessarily got it right first time.
I remember the debates around what exactly is best execution. Went on and on and on.
But yeah, completely. I mean, all of these definitional terms. If you define something in order to not necessarily describe an existing population of things, but you define something in the kind of, if we define it, it will come theory of regulation, then I think it is tremendously difficult to find those ab initio definitions. I think probably also one angle to this is going to be actually what types of artificial intelligence need to be subject to regulatory supervision. So I suppose if by comparison, maybe you look at the outsourcing rules. So there you're looking at things which contribute in a material way to someone's ability to carry on their regulated activities or to comply with their obligations. And then on the other hand, you've got services you're receiving from someone which are, I don't know, like getting your photocopier topped up, that kind of thing. And I think probably there's a similar distinction to be made in AI as well. And I think, again, it's going to be very important to draw that line. So maybe looking at the second category, there's quite a lot of sort of back office AI that maybe doesn't need to be subject to specific regulation. So certainly lots of firms are using AI tools in connection with things like their LIBOR transition projects. They might be using AI to review machine readable documents, or even to create those documents in the first place and identify particular problems. Similarly, we've seen lots of firms using AI tools to help them monitor compliance with regulatory obligations like money laundering obligations. And I think we saw a couple of days ago, Commerzbank was fined £38 million for AML breaches, which, while they stemmed in part from the technology they were using for AML monitoring, the issue there was the breach of the rules, not just the fact that they were using AI to do that monitoring. And I think in the UK, at least, a lot of these issues are already addressed by the existing regulation around having appropriate systems and controls, and then by the specific obligations under, in this case, the money laundering regulations. So I'm not sure that there's a need for additional regulation for that sort of use of AI tools. But then if you're looking at more the front office applications of AI, so anything that's client facing, anything that does contribute to your ability to carry on your regulated activities, so for example, trading, AI, advice, anything along those lines, I think maybe the solution here would be a more principles-based approach, or at least, that's probably where I'd start if I was writing the regulation from scratch. So regulators don't need to know how a particular algorithm actually works. They don't need to go into the weeds of it. They don't need to be retraining all of their supervisors to use Python, for example. But they can use what is their core expertise, which is identifying governance risks or conduct risks or systems and controls risks around how that AI functions, and then designing rules around those principles. So I think where people have looked at these sorts of issues, we've seen principles like transparency and trustworthiness of AI tools, controls around reliability and impact. So, making sure you've tested it before it gets out there in the real world, and then also that you do back testing as you go along. Data protection and privacy breaches. So clearly transparency around how you're using that data, client data, in the wake of things like Cambridge Analytica. People have got much more sensitive around knowing that if they're receiving a free service, then probably they themselves are the product. So that sensitivity around how AI is then using data. And then
it's also kind of like how that data is being used. I think a lot of people realize that their personal data is being harvested, but what came out of Cambridge Analytica was it was being used in a way that wasn't quite clear.
No, completely. And maybe to take a slightly less emotionally invested example, say Amazon, for example, and I think they've been prevented from doing this now. They've stopped doing this. Amazon were using an algorithm so that when you went on and looked for something, maybe you'd pop it in your basket, you come back and have a second think about it later, and you'd find that the price creeped up. Whereas actually, if you access the website with no cookies or from someone else's computer, you find you get a completely different price. So I think that's, again, it's not a Cambridge Analytica scandal sort of situation, but I think people would be quite sensitive to use of data, which meant that they end up receiving financial services or other services at a different price point from other people.
Yeah. I mean, I think I heard a very similar story about Target in the US that did a very similar thing. I found everything you just said very, very clear and easy to understand. There's always this, when you talk about artificial intelligence, it's, there's tools that you use to just sort through data and do mundane tasks, and then tools that affect, client decisions and the front end. And it's an interesting discussion between the two. Yeah. So I wanted to end our conversation with a bit of a human question. And with all apologies to Marie Kondo, I just wanted to ask you what brings you joy as a person.
I mean, you mentioned Marie Kondo, and I'm afraid that tidying really doesn't do it for me. But I think maybe specifically over lockdown, there's probably been a couple of things. So one is seeing a lot more of my children. So homeschooling was a total car crash, and we'll gloss over that. But
I don't think that's unique to you in your household.
No, I know. I mean, there's a reason why 90% of the population aren't primary school teachers, and we've all discovered that. But aside from that, I think just not working from home, not having the commute, I think has given me a lot of opportunity to see them a lot more. I can finish work at 7 and I don't have to commute home for an hour so I can see them straight away and do bedtime every day, which is fantastic. I think maybe on a lighter note, I think one thing that's given me joy is doing Zoom calls over lockdown and finding the extravagant facial hair that a lot of people have grown. I just worried that people have felt stigmatized maybe about growing beards, and now lockdown, they thought that no one was going to see them. They thought they were safe to grow a beard. I'd just like people to know, it's safe to grow a beard. When we go back into the office, I'd like to see those beards remain.
Excellent. So seeing your children and beards on Zoom calls, excellent. Wonderful. Caroline, thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to chat.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Take care.